Parents abandon girl for being ugly. Years later, she becomes a famous veteran. The morning sun cast long shadows across the San Diego military base as Major Sophia Reynolds stood at her office window, coffee cup in hand. The familiar sounds of boots on pavement and distant drill commands filled the air, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the retirement paperwork sitting on her desk, or maybe it was the growing weight of everything she'd left unsaid and undone over her 25 years of service. Sophia took a sip of her coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who'd earned every bit of her 45 years, steel gray starting to streak through her dark hair, laugh lines around her eyes that came more from squinting in desert sun than actual laughter. She'd never been one for makeup or fuss, and her uniform sat on her tall frame with the comfort of a second skin. The walls of her office told the story of her career better than she ever could. Photos covered nearly every inch of space: her first deployment, countless missions, faces of soldiers she'd served with, some who'd made it home and others who hadn't. In one corner, a small frame held her most precious photo: Sister Evelyn standing beside an 18-year-old Sophia on the day she enlisted, both of them beaming at the camera. A knock on her door broke through her thoughts. "Come in," she called out, turning to face one of her younger officers, Lieutenant Garcia. "Major Reynolds, the new recruits are ready for inspection," Garcia said, standing at attention. Sophia nodded, setting down her coffee cup. "At ease, Lieutenant. How are they looking?" "Nervous as hell, ma'am, but ready." She allowed herself a small smile. "Aren't we all nervous at first?" Walking toward the door, she grabbed her cap from its hook. "Let's go see what they're made of." As they walked across the base, several soldiers stopped to salute. Sophia returned each one with precision, even as her mind wandered. These might be among her last salutes as an active duty officer. The thought should have bothered her more than it did. The new recruits stood in formation, trying their best to look straight ahead as she approached. Sophia saw herself in their faces, the same mix of fear and determination she'd felt standing in their shoes all those years ago. Back then, the military had seemed like the perfect escape, a way to prove herself to the world, to the parents who'd abandoned her, though she never admitted that part out loud. She walked the line slowly, inspecting uniforms, posture, everything she'd learned to look for over the years. These kids came from all walks of life, some running toward something, others running away, just like she had. Later that afternoon, Sophia sat alone in the mess hall, pushing food around her plate. The cacophony of voices and clattering trays around her faded into white noise as her thoughts drifted back to the orphanage. Sister Evelyn had been the only constant in her life there, the only one who saw past her tough exterior to the scared little girl underneath. The sister had found Sophia countless times hiding in the orphanage's small library, usually after another failed adoption interview. "You're stronger than you know," she'd say, sitting beside Sophia with a patience that seemed endless. "Sometimes the family we're born into isn't the family we're meant to have." Those words had carried Sophia through her darkest moments, through basic training, through her first deployment, through every promotion and setback. But lately, they'd started to feel hollow. She'd built a life around proving herself, around being strong enough to not need anyone. The photos in her office were of her military family, sure, but at the end of each day, she returned to an empty apartment. Her fork clinked against the plate as she set it down, appetite gone. The question that had haunted her since childhood, "Why wasn't I enough?" had grown louder since she'd submitted her retirement paperwork. Without the structure of military life, without the constant motion and purpose of her career, there'd be nothing to drown it out anymore. Back in her quarters that evening, Sophia found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, looking through her personal files. Not her military records, which were immaculate and full of commendations, but the small box she kept pushed to the back of her closet. Inside was everything she had from before her military life: her original birth certificate, adoption papers that were never finalized, and a few photos from the orphanage. The papers still smelled faintly of the manila envelope they'd been stored in at St. Mary's Home for Children. Sophia's fingers traced the edges of her birth certificate, lingering over the blank spaces where parent information should have been. She'd memorized every detail of this document years ago, but something about seeing it now, with retirement looming, made it feel different. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Sister Evelyn checking in. The old nun had finally learned to text a few years back, though she still signed every message with love, Sister E, as if it were a letter. Sophia smiled despite herself, remembering how the sister had always seemed to know exactly when she needed support. Looking around her quarters, Sophia realized how impersonal it all was. Sure, there were the photos of her military career, her medals displayed properly on the wall, but nothing that really spoke to who she was outside of being Major Reynolds. She'd kept it that way on purpose, easier to pack up, easier to move on. The military life suited her that way, always ready for the next deployment, the next assignment. But now, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her past literally in her lap, Sophia felt the weight of all the things she'd never allowed herself to want. A real home, not just quarters. A family, not just soldiers under her command. Answers to questions she'd buried under years of service and duty. A knock at her door startled her out of her thoughts. Quickly shoving the papers back in their box, she called out, "Just a minute." As she tucked the box away, she caught her reflection in the mirror, and for a moment, saw the same lost little girl who used to hide in the orphanage library. Opening the door, she found Colonel Martinez, her commanding officer, standing there with concern etched on his face. "Reynolds, got a minute?" "Of course, sir." She stepped aside to let him in, automatically straightening her already immaculate quarters. "At ease, Sophia," he said, using her first name, something he only did in private and only when something was serious. "I wanted to check in. Your retirement paperwork crossed my desk today." Sophia nodded, maintaining her composure even as her throat tightened. "Yes, sir." 25 years seemed like a good run. Martinez looked at her for a long moment, the way he did when he knew someone wasn't telling him everything. You know, retirement isn't just an ending. It can be a beginning, too. His words hit closer to home than he could have known. Sophia managed a small smile. "I'm still figuring out what that means, sir." After he left, Sophia sat at her small desk and pulled out her laptop. Her finger hovered over the keyboard before she finally typed Sister Evelyn into her contacts and hit call. As the phone rang, she looked at the box in her closet, visible through the slightly open door. Maybe it was time to stop running from her past and finally face it head-on. The familiar voice that answered brought an immediate sense of comfort. "Sophia? Is everything all right?" For the first time in years, Sophia let herself be completely honest. "I don't know, sister. I really don't know." Sister Evelyn's voice crackled through the phone, warm and familiar despite the late hour. "Tell me what's really on your mind, dear. You never call this late unless something's eating at you." Sophia paced her quarters, phone pressed to her ear. Her free hand fidgeted with the dog tags around her neck, an old habit she'd never quite broken. "I keep thinking about them, sister. My birth parents. I know it's stupid after all these years, but dash. It's not stupid." Sister Evelyn cut in gently. "It's never been stupid." Sophia sank into her desk chair, suddenly exhausted. The clock on her wall showed just past midnight, but sleep felt miles away. "I've built this whole life, you know? Made something of myself." Major Sophia Reynolds, decorated veteran, respected officer. "But lately it all feels like I've been trying to prove something to people who probably don't even remember my name." The silence on the other end stretched for a moment before Sister Evelyn spoke again. "I've kept something from you, Sophia. Not because I wanted to, but because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Her fingers tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" "Your adoption records weren't completely sealed. There was some information. Names. A last known address. I kept it safe, thinking someday you might want it." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Sophia closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. "You've had this information all this time? You were so angry when you were younger, and rightly so. Then you joined the military, found your purpose. I didn't want to disrupt that. But maybe now, with retirement coming up..." Sister Evelyn's voice trailed off. Sophia stood up abruptly, needing to move. She walked to her window, looking out at the quiet base. A few lights still burned in distant buildings, night patrol making their rounds. This base had been her home for so long, its routines as familiar as breathing. But now it felt like the walls were closing in. I need to know, sister. Whatever you have, I need to see it. The next morning, Sophia sat in her office, staring at her computer screen. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night thinking about Sister Evelyn's revelation. The morning's tasks felt trivial, reviewing reports, signing off on requisitions, meetings about meetings. Her mind kept drifting to the envelope Sister Evelyn promised to send. Lieutenant Garcia popped his head in around noon. Major, we missed you at the morning briefing. Sophia blinked, realizing she'd completely forgotten about it.
Sorry, Lieutenant.
Had some personal matters to attend to. The words felt strange in her mouth. She never put personal matters before duty. No problem, ma'am. Colonel Martinez covered for you. Said you weren't feeling well. She nodded, grateful for Martinez's discretion. Thanks, Garcia. I'll catch up on what I missed. But as soon as he left, Sophia pulled up a search for private investigators in San Diego. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she finally started typing. The military had taught her that reconnaissance was crucial before any mission, and this felt like the most important mission of her life. She found herself in a small office downtown that afternoon, sitting across from a private investigator named David Chin. He had kind eyes and an efficient manner that put her at ease. So you're looking for your birth parents, he said, reviewing the notes he'd taken. And you have some initial information coming from your old orphanage?
Yes.
Should have it in a few days. Sophia sat straight backed in her chair, as if she were in a military briefing rather than a private investigator's office. I need to know everything, who they are, where they are, why they...
She stopped, swallowing hard.
Chin nodded, understanding what she couldn't say. Finding people is what I do, Major Reynolds. But I need to ask, are you sure you're ready for whatever we might find? The question hit her harder than she expected. Was she ready? She'd faced combat, led troops through impossible situations, made decisions that meant life or death. But this felt different. This felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing how far down the ground was. No, she admitted finally. I'm not sure I'm ready at all, but I need to do it anyway. The envelope from Sister Evelyn arrived 3 days later. Sophia sat with it on her coffee table for hours before finally opening it. Inside, she found yellowed papers and a brief note in Sister Evelyn's familiar handwriting. Remember, your worth isn't determined by their choices. Love, Sister E. The documents told a sparse story. Martha and Gregory Monroe, both 19 when they left their baby at St. Mary's. No reason given, no contact information left. Just signatures on forms that sever their connection to their child. Sophia found herself reaching for her phone, dialing Sister Evelyn's number before she could stop herself. It was late again, but the sister answered on the second ring. I got the papers, Sophia said without preamble. Did you ever meet them? The Monroes?
No, dear.
They came at night, spoke only to Sister Margaret. She passed years ago. Left you wrapped in a blue blanket with just a note saying your name was Sophia. Sophia's free hand clenched into a fist. They named me, at least. That's something, I guess. You are such a beautiful baby, Sister Evelyn said softly. So alert, always watching everything. Sister Margaret said she'd never seen such old eyes in such a young face. The words brought unexpected tears to Sophia's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, glad no one could see her. I need to find them, sister. I need to know why. I know you do. Just be careful with your heart, Sophia. Sometimes the answers we get aren't the ones we're looking for. Back at the base the next day, Sophia found it harder than ever to focus on her duties. She caught herself staring at the photos on her office walls, really looking at them for the first time in years. So many faces, so many memories, but none of them showed who she was before the uniform, before she'd built herself into Major Reynolds. Colonel Martinez stopped by in the afternoon, closing her office door behind him. You seem distracted lately, Reynolds. Everything okay? Sophia considered deflecting, giving her usual "everything's fine, sir" response. But something made her hesitate. Permission to speak freely, sir? Always. I'm looking for my birth parents. The words came out in a rush. I know it's not the best timing with retirement coming up, but dash. Martinez held up a hand, stopping her. Sophia, you've given 25 years to the military. You've earned the right to take care of yourself now. He paused, studying her face. You know, my wife was adopted too. Found her birth family 10 years ago. It wasn't easy, but she says it was worth it, just to know. Sophia felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Did it give her closure? I don't think closure is really the right word. More like understanding. Of herself, mostly. He smiled slightly. Take whatever time you need. Your duties will keep. That evening, Sophia met with David Chen again, this time bringing the documents from Sister Evelyn. As he reviewed them, she found herself talking more than she had in years, telling him about growing up in the orphanage, about Sister Evelyn, about joining the military to prove she could make it on her own. Chen listened carefully, taking notes. The military became your family, he observed. It did. For a long time, that was enough. Sophia looked down at her hands, surprised to find them trembling slightly. But now I need to know where I came from. Who I came from. Even if it hurts. We'll find them, Chen promised. But remember, you're not that abandoned baby anymore. You're approaching this as Major Sophia Reynolds, on your own terms. His words stayed with her as she drove back to the base. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She thought about all the sunsets she'd watched from various military posts around the world, always feeling like she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once.
Maybe that was about to change.
Maybe finding her birth parents would finally fill that empty space inside her, or maybe it would just confirm what she'd always feared. Either way, she needed to know. In her quarters that night, Sophia took out an old photo album she rarely looked at, and it was a picture of her at 18, standing proud in her first uniform. Sister Evelyn had taken the photo, beaming with pride even as tears gleamed in her eyes. Time to finish this mission, Sophia whispered to her younger self in the photo. Time to find out who we really are. David Chen's office looked different in the morning light, less intimidating somehow. Sophia sat across from his desk, coffee untouched in front of her, as he pulled up documents on his computer screen. I found them, he said simply. 3 words. Just 3 words, but they made Sophia's throat go dry. She gripped the arms of her chair, studying herself. Where? Small town outside Houston. Cypress, Texas. Chun turned his monitor so she could see. They've been there for about 30 years. Martha works part-time at the Children's Hospital, ironically enough, and Gregory recently retired from his accounting firm. Sophia stared at the screen, at the Facebook photos showing an elderly couple volunteering at church events, standing proudly at graduation ceremonies, holding grandchildren. Her birth parents looked normal. Happy. The kind of people you'd smile at in the grocery store without a second thought. There's more, Chen said gently. They have other children. 2 of them. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Sophia forced herself to take a deep breath, just like she taught her soldiers to do in stressful situations. Tell me. A son and a daughter. James is 42. Sarah is 39. Both married, both with kids of their own. Chen paused, watching her carefully. They had James 3 years after. After they gave me up, Sophia finished, her voice flat. She stood up abruptly, needing to move. The office felt too small suddenly, the walls too close. Through the window, she could see people going about their normal morning routines, walking dogs, getting coffee, heading to work. How strange that the world kept turning while hers felt like it had stopped. They're active in their community, Chen continued, his voice professional but kind. Church volunteers, hospital board members. Gregory coaches Little League. Martha runs a book club. They're well-liked, respected. Sophia laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Pillars of the community. Perfect parents. Except for the baby they dumped at an orphanage. Do you want to see more photos? She did and she didn't. But she made herself turn back to the screen, made herself look at the smiling faces of the siblings she never knew she had. James looked like their father. Same strong jaw, same crinkles around his eyes when he smiled. Sarah had their mother's delicate features and warm brown eyes. Her eyes. Sophia had her mother's eyes. I need their address, she heard herself say. Chun hesitated. Major Reynolds. Sophia, maybe you should take some time to process this first. I've had 45 years to process this. She straightened her shoulders, falling back on military posture like armor. I need their address and I need to know their schedules. When they volunteer, where they go, what they do. I want full reconnaissance before I make contact. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'll put together a complete file. But can I make a suggestion? Go ahead. They give talks at their church sometimes about their volunteer work. There's one scheduled for next week. It might be easier, safer, to observe them there first, before making direct contact. Sophia considera. This, the tactical part of her mind, already working. A public setting. Multiple exits. No chance of being trapped in an emotional confrontation. Send me the details. Back at the base, Sophia went through her day on autopilot. She led a training exercise, reviewed personnel files, attended a budget meeting. But her mind kept drifting to those photos. To the family gatherings she'd never been part of, the siblings who didn't know she existed, the parents who'd built a perfect life without her. That evening, she found herself in the base chapel, sitting in the back pew. She wasn't religious, never had been, but something about the quiet space helped her think. The setting sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows on the floor. Didn't expect to find you here, a voice said softly. Colonel Martinez sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. Just thinking, sir. Find what you were looking for? Sophia stared at the cross at the front of the chapel.
Found them.
They're in Texas.
Married.
2 other kids. Perfect life. Martinez was quiet for a moment. What's your plan? Going to Texas next week. They're giving some talk at their church. Thought I'd observe first. Want company? The offer surprised her. She turned to look at him, seeing not her commanding officer, but a friend who understood what she was facing. I appreciate it, sir, but this is something I need to do alone. The flight to Houston felt longer than any deployment she'd ever been on. Sophia sat rigid in her window seat, watching Texas spread out below her like a patchwork quilt. She'd packed light. Old habits die hard, just a small carry-on with civilian clothes.
No uniform this time.
No rank to hide behind. Her rental car was waiting at the airport, a modest sedan that wouldn't stand out in a church parking lot. The drive to Cypress took her through suburbs that all looked alike, neat houses, manicured lawns, American flags fluttering in the spring breeze. The kind of neighborhoods she used to dream about as a kid. The hotel room was clean and anonymous, like countless others she'd stayed in during her career. Sophia unpacked methodically, laying out clothes for tomorrow's reconnaissance mission. That's how she had to think of it, a mission. Not a desperate attempt to understand why her parents had kept her siblings, but not her. She called Sister Evelyn that night, sitting cross-legged on the hotel bed, like she used to sit on her bunk at the orphanage. I saw pictures of them, she said after they'd exchanged greetings. They look happy. Oh, Sophia. Sister Evelyn's voice was full of understanding. Are you sure you want to do this?
No.
But I have to. Sophia picked at a loose thread on the bedspread. They had other kids, sister. A boy and a girl. They kept them. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Finally, Sister Evelyn said, remember what I always told you? Sometimes the family we're born into isn't the family we're meant to have. I remember. Sophia smiled despite herself. I've got my family. You, my soldiers, my command. I need to know why. Then find out. But don't let their answer define you. You've done that enough already. The next morning, Sophia drove to the Monroe's neighborhood, doing a slow pass by their house. It was a beautiful Victorian, painted pale yellow with white trim. Flower boxes hung from the windows, and a wooden swing moved gently in the breeze on the wide front porch. A silver SUV sat in the driveway, Martha's car, according to Chen's report. Sophia parked a block away, watching. She'd done surveillance before in much more dangerous situations than this. But her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Around mid-morning, she saw them for the first time. Martha and Gregory Monroe stepped out onto their porch, Gregory locking the door behind them. They looked exactly like their photos, a handsome older couple, well-dressed, moving with the comfortable synchronicity of people who'd spent decades together. They got into the SUV and drove past Sophia's car without a glance. She waited a few minutes, then followed them to the grocery store. Watched as they picked out produce together, Gregory making Martha laugh at something he said. Watched as they helped an elderly woman reach something from a high shelf. Watched as they chatted with the cashier like old friends. They were everything she'd imagined and feared they'd be.
Kind.
Normal. The type of parents any child would want. Any child except her, apparently. Back in her hotel room that evening, Sophia laid out her clothes for tomorrow's church talk. She'd chosen carefully. Conservative dress, modest heels, nothing that would draw attention. Her dog tags sat on the bedside table, and she resisted the urge to put them on. Tomorrow, she wouldn't be Major Reynolds. She'd just be Sophia, the daughter they'd thrown away. Sleep eluded her. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering all the nights she'd done the same thing at the orphanage. All the times she'd imagined her parents coming back for her, explaining that it had all been a terrible mistake. All the times she'd promised herself that someday she'd be someone they'd regret losing. Well, she'd become someone. Major Sophia Reynolds, decorated war veteran, respected leader. But looking at those happy family photos, she wondered if they'd ever regretted their decision at all. Tomorrow she'd find out. Tomorrow she'd sit in their church and watch them talk about charity and community and family values. Tomorrow she'd see the life she could have had if only she'd been worth keeping. Sophia got up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet Texas night. Somewhere out there, her parents were probably getting ready for bed in their beautiful Victorian house, never knowing their firstborn daughter was less than a mile away. Ready or not, she whispered to her reflection in the window, "Here I come." The church parking lot was already half full when Sophia arrived. She parked near the back, watching people file in, families in their Sunday best, elderly couples walking arm in arm, kids running ahead of their parents. Normal people living normal lives. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. For a moment, she considered starting the car and driving away. Back to San Diego, back to her ordered military life where everything made sense. But she'd never run from a fight before, and she wasn't about to start now. Inside, the church smelled of wood polish and coffee. A teenager handed her a program with a bright smile. "Welcome. Are you here for the Volunteer Appreciation Day?" Sophia nodded, not trusting her voice. The program listed Martha and Gregory Monroe as keynote speakers, talking about their decades of service at the Children's Hospital. The irony wasn't lost on her. She chose a seat near the middle, not too close, not too far. Perfect observation position. Old habits die hard. People filled in around her, chatting and laughing. A young mother with a baby sat down 2 rows ahead, the infant cooing softly. Sophia watched them, wondering if that's how she'd looked in Martha's arms, in those brief moments before they decided she wasn't worth keeping. Then she saw them. Her parents walked up to the podium together, Martha adjusting the microphone while Gregory sorted through some notes. They looked exactly like their photos. Martha in a flower dress that probably came from some expensive boutique, Gregory in pressed khakis and a blue button-down shirt. They looked right, like they belonged here. "Good morning, everyone," Martha began, her voice warm and confident. "Greg and I are so blessed to be here today, sharing our experiences from the Children's Hospital."
Blessed.
The word hit Sophia like a physical blow. She'd never felt blessed, not in all her years at the orphanage, not in all the foster homes that never quite worked out. "We've been volunteering there for over 30 years now," Gregory continued. "It started when our own children were young. We wanted to teach them the importance of giving back, their own children, James and Sarah, the ones they'd kept. Sophia's fingernails dug into her palms. The talk continued, full of heartwarming stories about sick kids they'd helped, families they'd supported. Martha's eyes teared up as she described holding the hand of a terrified mother during her child's surgery. Gregory's voice cracked when he talked about a little boy who'd beaten cancer and still came back to visit them. They were good people. That was the worst part. They were genuinely good people who cared about children, who spent their free time helping families stay together through crisis, who'd thrown away their firstborn without a second thought. Our greatest blessing has been our family, Martha was saying now. Our children, our grandchildren, they've grown up understanding the importance of community, of helping others. Sophia felt sick. The walls seemed to be closing in. She needed air, needed to move, needed to run. But her military training kept her rooted in place, face carefully blank, breathing steady and controlled. A photo appeared on the screen behind them, the whole Monroe family at some holiday gathering. James and Sarah with their spouses, kids sprawled on the floor, Martha and Gregory beaming in the middle of it all. The perfect family portrait. The talk ended to warm applause. People stood up, moved toward the refreshment tables at the back. Sophia stayed in her seat, watching as people surrounded her parents, shaking hands, offering congratulations. Martha hugged an elderly woman, laughing at something she said. Gregory ruffled a little boy's hair. They were everything she'd imagined parents should be, everything she'd never had. Before she knew what she was doing, Sophia was on her feet, moving toward them. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her steps were steady. Years of military discipline kept her upright, kept her moving forward even as every instinct screamed at her to retreat. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe? Her voice sounded strange in her ears, too calm, too controlled. They turned toward her, identical polite smiles on their faces. The same kind of smile they probably gave everyone. Yes, Martha said. Did you enjoy the talk? It was very interesting. Sophia's hands were shaking. She clasped them behind her back, parade rest position. Especially the part about family, about helping children. Something in her tone must have caught their attention. The smiles faltered slightly. Gregory stepped closer, protective. I'm sorry, have we met?
No.
Sophia met their eyes, first Gregory's, then Martha's. But you should know me. I'm your daughter, your first daughter. The one you left at St. Mary's Home for Children 45 years ago. The color drained from Martha's face. Gregory's hand shot out to steady his wife. Around them, people continued chatting, drinking coffee, eating cookies, oblivious to the bomb that had just gone off in their midst. Perhaps. Gregory's voice was shaky. Perhaps we should take this somewhere private. They ended up in the pastor's office, a small room lined with books. Martha sat in an armchair, Gregory standing behind her like a guard. Sophia remained standing, her military bearing the only thing keeping her together. Why? The question came out before she could stop it. Why did you keep them but not me? Martha's hands twisted in her lap. We were so young. We weren't ready. You were ready 3 years later for James. Sophia's voice was ice cold. And 6 years later for Sarah. That was different, Gregory said. We were more stable then, had careers started. We thought. Martha's voice broke. We thought you'd have a better life, with a family that was ready for you. Sophia laughed, a harsh sound that made them both flinch. A better life? Do you know what it's like in an orphanage? Do you know what it's like to watch other kids get adopted while you're left behind? To wonder what was wrong with you, why your own parents didn't want you. Tears were running down Martha's face now. We were scared. We were just kids ourselves. So you threw away your kid, then had more when it was convenient. Sophia's hands were shaking again. Do they know about me? James and Sarah? Do they know they have a sister? The looks on their faces gave her the answer. Of course they didn't know. She was the family secret, the skeleton in the closet, the stain on their perfect life. We've thought about you, Martha whispered. Wondered where you were, if you were okay. But not enough to look for me. Not enough to tell your other children they had a sister. Sophia straightened her shoulders. Well, don't worry. I did okay. Made something of myself. No thanks to you. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. You know what the worst part is? You're actually good people. You help other families stay together. You volunteer at a children's hospital, for God's sake. But you couldn't help your own child. The door closed behind her with a soft click. She walked through the church, past the happy families, past the coffee and cookies, past the teenager who'd given her the program, out into the bright Texas sunshine that suddenly felt too harsh, too exposing. In her car, she finally let herself break. Tears came in silent waves, years of pain and anger pouring out. She'd imagined this moment so many times, confronting them, demanding answers. But the reality was worse than anything she'd imagined. Because they weren't monsters. They were just people who'd made a choice, who'd moved on with their lives while she'd spent 45 years trying to prove she was worth keeping. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sister Evelyn. Thinking of you today. Remember who you are. Sophia stared at the message through blurry eyes.
Who was she?
Major Sophia Reynolds, decorated veteran? The abandoned baby from St. Mary's? The sister James and Sarah never knew they had? She started the car. She needed to get away from this church, from this town, from these people who'd shaped her life by their absence. But as she drove, she realized something. The answers she'd spent her life searching for hadn't brought closure. They'd just opened new wounds she didn't know how to heal. The drive back to her hotel was a blur. Sophia's military training kept her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes on the road, but her mind was in chaos. She'd done it. She'd confronted them. She should feel triumphant, victorious. Instead, she felt hollow. Her phone kept buzzing with texts from Sister Evelyn, but she couldn't look at them yet. Couldn't talk to anyone. She needed to process, to compartmentalize, the way she'd learned to do with trauma in the field. The hotel room felt smaller than before, the walls closer. Sophia paced, 7 steps one way, 7 steps back, like measuring the dimensions of a cell. Her reflection caught her eye. She still looked put together, hair neat, dress unwrinkled. Only her red-rimmed eyes gave her away. Pull it together, soldier, she muttered to herself, but the words felt empty. She should pack, head to the airport, get back to the base where everything made sense. But her hands wouldn't cooperate. Instead, she found herself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. Finally, she called Sister Evelyn. I did it, she said when the nun answered. I confronted them. Oh, Sophia. Sister Evelyn's voice was warm with concern. How are you holding up?
I'm fine.
The lie came automatically. They're good people, sister. That's the worst part. They help kids at the hospital. They volunteer. They're the perfect parents. Her voice cracked on the last word. But not to you.
No.
Not to me. Sophia stood up, needing to move again. They had 2 more kids. Did I tell you that? James and Sarah. The ones they kept. The ones they were ready for. Their readiness or lack thereof had nothing to do with your worth, Sophia. Didn't it? Sophia laughed, a harsh sound that surprised even her. They got their lives together, had more kids, built this perfect family. And I was just their practice run. Their mistake. You were never a mistake. But Sophia wasn't listening anymore. She was looking at her reflection again, seeing herself through her birth parents' eyes. What had they seen 45 years ago that made them decide she wasn't worth keeping? What was wrong with her that they could throw her away so easily? I showed them, she said, more to herself than Sister Evelyn. I made something of myself. Major Sophia Reynolds, decorated veteran, leader. I proved I was worth something. You didn't need to prove anything to them, didn't I? Sophia's voice rose. Their perfect kids probably never had to prove anything. They probably got told they were worthy just for existing. While I had to earn every scrap of approval, every bit of respect. She could hear Sister Evelyn trying to respond, but the words weren't getting through. The victory she'd imagined, the closure she'd sought, it was all turning to ash in her mouth. I need to go, she said abruptly, cutting off whatever Sister Evelyn was saying. I'll call you later. She ended the call and stood there, phone clutched in her hand, feeling more lost than she had in years. Since she was 18, the military had given her structure, purpose, identity. Major Reynolds didn't need parents' approval. Major Reynolds was strong, capable, respected. But standing in this anonymous hotel room in Texas, she didn't feel like Major Reynolds anymore. She felt like that little girl in the orphanage again, watching other kids get chosen while she was left behind. The next few days back at the base were a study in pretense. Sophia went through the motions, leading drills, attending meetings, signing paperwork. But her mind kept drifting back to that church, to Martha's tears, to Gregory's defensive stance. "You okay, Major?" Lieutenant Garcia asked after she zoned out during a briefing for the third time. "You seem different since you got back from leave."
"Ai fine, Lieutenant."
The words came automatically now, rehearsed and hollow. But she wasn't fine. The anger she'd carried for years had transformed into something else, something harder to define. She'd imagined confronting her birth parents would be like winning a battle, decisive, final, clear. Instead, it felt like she'd opened a door she couldn't close. At night, alone in her quarters, she found herself looking up her siblings on social media. James Monroe, successful architect, coach of his kids' soccer team. Sarah Monroe Peterson, elementary school teacher, mother of 3. Their lives played out in photos, birthday parties, family vacations, holiday gatherings. All the normal moments she'd never had. She should delete the photos, block their profiles, move on. But she couldn't stop looking. Couldn't stop wondering what it would have been like to grow up with them. Would James have been protective of his little sisters? Would Sarah have shared her secrets with her older sister? Colonel Martinez found her in her office one evening, staring at her computer screen instead of working on her retirement paperwork. "Want to talk about it?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "Nothing to talk about, sir." But her voice lacked conviction. "You know what my wife said when she found her birth family?" He sat down across from her desk. She said the hardest part wasn't meeting them. It was realizing that finding them didn't fix everything she thought it would. Sophia looked up sharply. Did she stay in contact with them? Eventually. Not right away. She had to figure out who she was first, separate from being their daughter, separate from being adopted. Had to understand that their choices didn't define her worth. The words hit too close to home. Sophia stood up abruptly, walking to her office window. I thought if I showed them what I'd become, it would hurt them, make them regret what they did." She laughed bitterly, but they just looked sad.
"Guilty, maybe.
Not destroyed. Not like I wanted. And now I don't know anything anymore." She turned back to face him. "My whole life, I've been trying to prove something. To them, to myself, to everyone. Be the best soldier, the best leader. Never show weakness. Never need anyone." Her voice cracked. But what was it all for? Martinez was quiet for a moment. Maybe that's the real question you need to answer. Not why they gave you up, but why you've let that choice define your whole life. The words hung in the air between them. Sophia felt something shift inside her, like a fortress wall developing its first crack. "I don't know how to be anything else," she admitted finally. "I don't know who I am without this drive to prove myself. Maybe it's time to find out." Martinez stood up. "Your retirement's coming up anyway. Maybe this is the universe telling you it's time for a different kind of mission." After he left, Sophia sat alone in her darkening office, his words echoing in her head. The photos on her walls seemed different now, less like trophies of her success and more like shields she'd hidden behind. She pulled out her phone, looking at the last text from Sister Evelyn. "When you're ready to talk, really talk, I'm here." Maybe it was time to stop pretending she'd won some great victory. Maybe it was time to admit that finding her birth parents hadn't given her closure. It had just shown her how much healing she still needed to do. But first, she had to figure out who she was beyond the abandoned daughter, beyond the decorated major. She had to find Sophia. Sleep became Sophia's enemy. Night after night, she lay awake in her quarters, memories playing on loop in her mind. Martha's tears in the church office. Gregory's defensive stance. The family photos she couldn't stop looking at. The perfect life she'd never been part of. During the day, she started making mistakes. Small ones at first, forgetting appointments, mixing up schedules, zoning out during important meetings. Her usually pristine uniform started showing wrinkles. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, deepening with each passing day. Major? Lieutenant Garcia's voice snapped her back to reality during a training exercise. The recruits are waiting for your command. Sophia blinked, realizing she'd been standing there silent for who knows how long, 30 pairs of eyes watching her expectantly. She couldn't remember what she was supposed to tell them. Dismissed, she said finally, turning away from their confused faces. That evening, she found herself back in the base chapel, sitting in the same spot where she'd talked to Colonel Martinez before going to Texas. The quiet space felt different now, less peaceful, more accusatory. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Sister Evelyn, who'd been trying to reach her for days. Sophia had stopped responding. What could she say? That she'd finally found her birth parents, and it had broken something inside her? That she couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore? A noise made her turn. Colonel Martinez stood in the doorway, concern etched on his face. Lieutenant Garcia came to see me, he said, walking over to sit beside her. Says you've been different since Texas. Distracted. Not yourself. I'm handling it, sir. Are you? He looked at her steadily. When's the last time you slept through the night? Sophia opened her mouth to lie, then closed it. She couldn't remember. I thought. She stopped, swallowed hard. I thought once I knew why they gave me up, I could move on. But now I can't stop thinking about it.
About them.
About their other kids. About everything I missed. It's eating you alive, Reynolds. I'm fine. But even as she said it, her hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. You're not fine. And that's okay. Martinez's voice was gentle. You've spent your whole life being strong. Maybe it's time to let yourself be human for a while. The words hit her like a physical blow. A sound escaped her throat, something between a laugh and a sob. She pressed her hands to her mouth to stop more from coming. I don't know how, she whispered finally. Start by talking to someone. A professional. He held up a hand when she started to protest. That's an order, Major. I'm not watching one of my best officers self-destruct because she's too stubborn to ask for help. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Sophia finally looked at Sister Evelyn's texts. The last one read, You don't have to carry this alone. Maybe Martinez was right. Maybe she didn't have to be strong all the time. Maybe. Her hands were dialing before she could talk herself out of it. I need to go back, she said when Sister Evelyn answered. To Texas. I need to really talk to them. Not just yell. Not just accuse. You need answers, Sister Evelyn finished softly. Real ones this time. Will you come with me? The question came out small, vulnerable, so unlike her usual voice. I don't think I can do it alone again. The silence on the other end felt endless. Finally, Sister Evelyn said, When do we leave? The flight to Houston felt different this time, with Sister Evelyn's steady presence beside her. The elderly nun had insisted on coming despite her arthritis, despite Sophia's guilt about making her travel. You were there at the beginning, Sister Evelyn had said. I should be there for this too. Sophia had arranged everything through David Chen, a message to the Monroes requesting a meeting, a different hotel this time, farther from their house. She couldn't stay so close again, couldn't risk driving past their perfect Victorian home with its flower boxes and porch swing. The Monroes had agreed to meet them at a quiet coffee shop. Neutral territory. When Sophia and Sister Evelyn walked in, they were already there, Martha and Gregory, looking smaller somehow than they had in the church, more human. You remember Sister Evelyn, Sophia said by way of greeting. She raised me. She was my real mother when you couldn't be. Martha flinched at the words, but nodded. Thank you, she said to Sister Evelyn, for taking care of her. I didn't come to make you feel better, Sophia cut in, sitting down. Her hands were shaking again, but she forced them still. I came because I need to understand. Really understand. Gregory cleared his throat. We told you before, Dash. You told me you were young. You told me you weren't ready. Sophia's voice was tight with control.
But I need more than that.
I need to know.
I need to know if you ever thought about me.
If you ever wondered, if you ever wanted to find me. Martha's eyes filled with tears.
Of course we thought about you.
Every birthday, every Christmas. But not enough to look for me. Not enough to tell James and Sarah they had a sister. We were ashamed, Gregory admitted quietly. We told ourselves we'd given you a better life, that someone else could care for you better than we could. But really, we were just scared kids who made a choice we couldn't take back. And then you had more kids. Sophia's voice cracked. You got your lives together and had more kids and just forgot about me. We never forgot, Martha insisted. But you're right. We were cowards. We told ourselves it would hurt the other children to know, that it would complicate their lives. But really, we were protecting ourselves. Sister Evelyn reached over and took Sophia's hand. Her grip was strong despite her age, grounding. I spent my whole life, Sophia said slowly, trying to be perfect, trying to prove I was worth keeping. I made major. I led troops. I saved lives. And still I wondered what was wrong with me, what you saw in me as a baby that made you decide I wasn't worth the effort. There was nothing wrong with you, Martha whispered. The problem was us. Only us. I want to believe that. Sophia's voice was barely audible, but I don't know how. Maybe, Sister Evelyn spoke for the first time, it's not about believing them. Maybe it's about believing in yourself. In the woman you've become, not in spite of their choice, but because of all the choices you've made since then. The words hung in the air between them. Sophia looked at her birth parents, really looked at them. Not as the monsters of her childhood nightmares, not as the perfect couple from the church, but as flawed humans who'd made a terrible choice they couldn't undo. I don't forgive you, she said finally. I don't know if I ever will. But I need to stop letting your choice control my life. I need to stop trying to prove something to you. Martha nodded, tears running down her face. Gregory reached for his wife's hand, his own eyes wet. We don't deserve forgiveness, he said. But you deserve peace. You deserve to be free of us, of what we did. Maybe someday, Sophia said, standing up. Maybe someday I'll be ready to hear more about James and Sarah, about your lives.
But not now.
Now I need to figure out who I am without this weight, without this need to prove myself. Sister Evelyn stood with her, steady as always. Together, they walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Martha and Gregory Monroe behind. But this time, Sophia didn't feel like she was running away. This time, she was walking toward something new, toward healing, toward herself. The San Diego air felt different when Sophia returned, or maybe she was the one who had changed. Sister Evelyn had flown back to New York, but her presence lingered in the way Sophia carried herself, a little softer now, a little less rigid. Colonel Martinez was waiting in her office when she arrived at the base. Welcome back, Reynolds. Thank you, sir. Sophia sat down, noticing how her usual military posture had relaxed slightly. I took your advice.
Talk to them.
Really talked this time. And I'm tired. The admission came easier than she expected. Tired of proving myself. Tired of being perfect. Tired of letting their choice define who I am. Martinez nodded, understanding in his eyes. So, what now? Now. Sophia looked around her office at the photos on the walls. For the first time, she saw them not as proof of her worth, but as memories. Good ones, hard ones, all part of who she'd become. Now I figure out who I am without all that armor. The next few weeks passed in a blur of change. Sophia started seeing the base counselor, Dr. Chun, no relation to the private investigator, though she'd laughed at the coincidence. She'd resisted at first, old habits of self-reliance dying hard. But there was something freeing about finally saying things out loud that she'd kept buried for decades. You built your identity around being the unwanted child who succeeded anyway, Dr. Chun said during one session. That's a heavy burden to carry. It was all I knew how to be, Sophia admitted. If I wasn't proving myself, who was I? That's what we're here to figure out. She started making small changes. Let her hair down sometimes instead of the strict military bun. Accepted invitations to coffee with other officers instead of eating alone. Called Sister Evelyn regularly, not just when things were bad. Lieutenant Garcia noticed the difference first. "You seem lighter, Major," he said one morning after training. "More present." Sophia thought about that as she walked back to her office. Present. That was it exactly. For so long, she'd been living either in the past, trying to prove something to the parents who'd abandoned her, or in the future, working toward the next promotion, the next achievement. She'd rarely just been in the moment. One evening, she found herself going through her box of orphanage documents again. But this time, instead of feeling the usual pain and anger, she felt something different. Gratitude, maybe, for Sister Evelyn, who'd loved her unconditionally. For the strength she'd found in herself. Even, strangely, for the hardships that had shaped her into someone who could lead, who could help others, who could understand pain and resilience. Her phone buzzed, a text from Martha Monroe. They'd been sending occasional messages since that day in the coffee shop. Nothing deep, just simple acknowledgments of existence. "Thinking of you today. Hope you're well." Sophia looked at the message for a long time. Before, it would have made her angry. How dare they think of her now, after all these years? But today, she just felt calm. They were who they were, flawed people who'd made a terrible choice. She didn't have to forgive them, but she also didn't have to let their choice control her anymore. The base chapel had become her thinking spot. Sophia sat there one evening, watching the sunset through stained glass windows, when she had an idea. The next day, she talked to the base commander about starting a mentoring program for young soldiers who'd aged out of foster care. "I know what it's like," she explained, "to feel like you have to prove yourself all the time. To think your worth depends on your achievements." The commander approved the program immediately. Within weeks, Sophia found herself working with a small group of soldiers who carried similar wounds to her own. She didn't tell them her whole story, not yet, but she listened to theirs. Really listened, the way she wished someone had listened to her at their age. "How do you do it, Major?" one young private asked after sharing his own story of foster homes and abandonment. "How do you make it stop hurting?" "It doesn't stop hurting," Sophia said honestly. "But you learn that the pain doesn't define you. Your strength does. Your choices do. The family you build for yourself does." She thought about those words later that night as she FaceTimed with Sister Evelyn. The elderly nun was showing her the latest improvements to the orphanage's library, now a bright, welcoming space where kids could feel safe. "Remember how you used to hide in here?" Sister Evelyn asked, panning the camera around the room. "Best hiding spot in the place," Sophia smiled. "Still is, from the looks of it. We have a little girl now who reminds me of you. Always watching, always trying to be so strong." "Tell her." Sophia paused, thinking. Tell her she's already strong enough. She doesn't have to prove anything. The words felt right in her mouth. True. Maybe that's what healing was, being able to tell others what you wish someone had told you. Her retirement date was approaching fast now. But instead of feeling adrift, Sophia felt ready. She'd already started volunteering at a local veteran center, helping other soldiers transition to civilian life. She was good at it, not because she was perfect, but because she understood struggle, understood what it meant to rebuild yourself. Martinez found her in her office one day, packing up years of photographs and memories. "Got plans for retirement?" "A few," she said, carefully wrapping a frame holding her favorite photo of her and Sister Evelyn. "The mentoring program's taking off. And I'm thinking about writing, sharing stories of resilience, not just mine but others. Maybe even reaching out to other military kids who aged out of foster care." "Sounds like you're building something new." "More like discovering what was already there." Sophia picked up another photo, her first day as major. "I spent so long trying to prove I was worth keeping that I never realized I already was. Just as I was." Martinez smiled. "Took you long enough to figure that out. Better late than never, right?" She looked around her office. Emptier now, but somehow fuller too. Fuller of possibility, of future, of peace. She'd gotten another text from Martha that morning. James and Sarah ask about you sometimes. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, they'd like to know their sister." Sophia hadn't responded yet. Maybe she would someday. Maybe not. The beautiful thing was, it didn't feel urgent anymore. She had family, Sister Evelyn, her fellow soldiers, the kids she mentored. She had purpose, not born from a need to prove herself, but from a desire to help others find their strength. She had herself. Finally, completely, herself. The morning of Sophia's retirement ceremony dawned clear and bright. She stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her uniform one last time. Every ribbon, every medal, every insignia perfectly placed, not because she needed to prove anything anymore, but because this uniform had been part of her journey, and it deserved respect. Sister Evelyn had flown in for the ceremony, despite Sophia's protests about the long trip. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," the elderly nun had said, her voice firm despite her 80 years. The base gymnasium was packed. Sophia stood at attention as Colonel Martinez read out her service record. 25 years, multiple deployments, countless commendations. But it was the unofficial achievements that meant more to her now. The lives she'd touched, the soldiers she'd mentored, the strength she'd found in herself. Major Reynolds isn't just leaving behind a distinguished military career, Martinez said, looking out at the crowd. She's leaving behind a legacy. The mentoring program she started for soldiers from foster care has already helped dozens of young service members find their footing. Her leadership style hasn't just been about giving orders. It's been about understanding people, about seeing their potential, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Sophia felt Sister Evelyn squeeze her hand. In the audience, she could see Lieutenant Garcia, some of the kids from her mentoring program, fellow officers who'd become friends rather than just colleagues. This was her family, not the one she'd been born into, but the one she'd built, choice by choice, day by day. After the ceremony, during the reception, her phone buzzed. A text from Martha Monroe. "Congratulations on your retirement. We saw the article in the military newsletter. You've done amazing things." 6 months ago, that message would have filled her with anger or bitter triumph. Now, she just felt peaceful. She typed back a simple "thank you" and put her phone away. Their approval or disapproval didn't define her anymore. "What are you thinking?" Sister Evelyn asked, bringing her a cup of punch. "About how far I've come." Sophia smiled. Remember that angry kid who used to hide in the library? Who thought if she just worked hard enough, was perfect enough, someone would want to keep her? "I remember." Sister Evelyn's eyes were warm with memory. She was already worthy of love. She just couldn't see it yet. She had help seeing it eventually. Sophia hugged the older woman carefully. "Thank you for everything." Later that evening, Sophia held a smaller gathering in her new apartment, her first real home, not just military quarters. She'd taken time decorating it, letting her personality show instead of maintaining the stark efficiency she'd hidden behind for so long. Photos still covered the walls, but now they included recent ones too. Her with her mentoring group, casual shots with friends, quiet moments with Sister Evelyn. Lieutenant Garcia, "Just call me Mike now that you're retired," raised his glass in a toast. "To the best commanding officer I've ever had." "And the best friend," added another off. "Aye, sir." "And the best mentor," chimed in one of the young soldiers from her program. Sophia looked around at these faces, these people who knew her, really knew her, not just her rank or her achievements, and felt something settle in her chest. This was belonging. This was family. This was home. The next few months brought changes, but good ones. Sophia threw herself into expanding the mentoring program, working with other bases to implement similar initiatives. She started writing, sharing stories of resilience and recovery. Not just her own, but others too. The words came easier now that she wasn't trying to prove anything. She kept the occasional contact with the Monroes, brief texts or emails that acknowledged their connection without demanding more than she was ready to give. Martha had sent her some old photos, Sophia as a baby, wrapped in that blue blanket. Instead of bringing pain, the pictures just felt like pieces of a puzzle she was finally ready to complete. One sunny afternoon, as she sat in her favorite coffee shop working on her latest writing project, her phone lit up with a message from James Monroe, her half-brother. "I know this is out of the blue, but Sarah and I would love to meet you someday. Only if and when you're ready. No pressure." Sophia stared at the message for a long time. Then she did something that surprised her. She smiled. Not because she was ready to meet them. She wasn't sure about that yet, but because for the first time, the idea didn't fill her with dread or anger or need. It was just a possibility, one she could explore or not, on her own terms. She showed the message to Dr. Chen during their next session. They'd continued meeting, not because she was broken, but because she'd learned the strength in asking for help. "How does it make you feel?" he asked. "Curious, maybe," she answered honestly. "Not desperate anymore. Not like I need their approval or acceptance. Just curious about who they are." "That's growth," he smiled. "Real growth." The orphanage library project had taken off too. Sophia had used some of her retirement funds to help Sister Evelyn modernize it, making it even more of a sanctuary for kids who needed one. She visited when she could, reading to the children, showing them that their past didn't have to define their future. "You've come full circle," Sister Evelyn said during one of these visits, watching Sophia help a young girl pick out a book. "Not quite a circle," Sophia corrected. "More like a spiral. Coming back to similar places, but from a different perspective, a different height." That evening, sitting on her apartment balcony watching the San Diego sunset, Sophia thought about all the ways she'd changed. The military bearing was still there, but softer now, balanced with a gentleness she'd never allowed herself before. She could look at old photos without pain, talk about her past without anger, face her future without the desperate need to prove herself. She pulled out her phone and finally replied to James's message. "Thank you for reaching out. I'm not ready yet, but maybe someday. In the meantime, would you like to know about the sister you have now, not just the baby your parents gave up?" His response came quickly. "We'd love that." Sophia smiled, watching the last rays of sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She'd spent so long looking for family in the past that she'd almost missed the family she'd built in the present. Now she had both, the understanding of where she came from and the knowledge of who she'd become. She wasn't the unwanted baby anymore. She wasn't even just Major Reynolds anymore. She was Sophia, sister, friend, mentor, survivor. And finally, completely, that was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.